All right, so you sent us a whole bunch of stuff about these possible peace talks between and Russia.
Yeah.
And it seems like you really want to understand, like, what could actually happen, what each side wants out of it, and what it all means for everyone else. You want the, like, down and dirty nitty-gritty, not just the surface level stuff.
Definitely.
And I see a lot of this is from this one expert commentary video. This expert really seems to be going deep, offering all kinds of different viewpoints, which is exactly what we're after.
For sure.
So let's get right to it.
Okay.
What does victory even look like for each side in this whole thing?
That's the question, isn't it? Because they seem like they're miles apart.
Yeah, for sure.
So on the one hand, you've got Ukraine.
Right.
They want all their territory back, of course.
Including Crimea.
Including Crimea, which is a huge sticking point for Russia, obviously.
Obviously.
And they want to be able to decide their own future.
Right, which could include joining NATO.
Exactly, and that's where things get really complicated.
Yeah, because on the other side, you have Russia, who wants to keep the land they've taken.
Of course.
They want to make sure Ukraine never joins NATO.
Right.
And they might even try to put a pro-Russian government in charge.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, no kidding.
It makes you wonder if finding some kind of middle ground is even possible.
Especially on the issue of territory.
Exactly. Like if Russia just gets to take land by force.
Yeah.
What kind of message does that send to other countries who might have similar ideas?
Totally throws the rule book out the window.
Pretty much. Yeah, it sets a really dangerous precedent.
So it sounds like a full-blown peace agreement where everyone's happy is pretty much off the table.
I think that's a fair assessment.
So what's the more likely scenario then?
Well, the expert seems to think it'll probably be a ceasefire.
Okay.
And what they call a frozen conflict.
A frozen conflict.
Yeah, essentially the fighting stops.
Okay.
Russia keeps control of the land they've taken. But the rest of the world doesn't recognize it as officially belonging to Russia.
So it's like hitting the pause button, but the problem's still there.
Exactly. It's unresolved.
Can you give me like an example of a frozen conflict?
Sure. You've got Transnistria.
Okay.
It's a breakaway region of Moldova. They declared independence way back in the early 90s.
Okay.
Russia has troops there.
Right.
But nobody recognizes them as an independent country.
So the conflict is just frozen?
Yep, stuck in time.
Interesting.
It happens more than you might think.
Okay, so if that's the most likely outcome, why is the U.S. even pushing for these talks?
Well,
I mean, what's in it for them?
That's a great question. And the expert points to a few possibilities.
Okay.
One is simply Trump's personality.
Oh, boy.
He likes to be seen as the guy who can fix things.
The deal maker.
Exactly the one who can solve problems that nobody else can.
Right, but is that all it is?
Maybe not. The expert also mentions the potential for business opportunities with Russia.
Ah, so there might be some money involved.
Possibly.
Okay, what about strategically?
Maybe.
Like Russia and China have been getting closer.
Oh, right.
Could this be a way for the U.S. to try and break them up?
Absolutely. The expert suggests that separating Russia from China is another potential motivation.
Makes sense. You don't want your rivals teaming up.
It's all about global power dynamics.
Okay, so there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
For sure, it's never as simple as it seems.
But here's another question. Does the U.S. even have the power to make Ukraine agree to a deal?
Especially without Europe on board.
Yeah, exactly, because Europe's got a lot at stake here, too.
Absolutely.
So what do you think?
Well, the expert suggests that the U.S. could pressure Ukraine.
How?
By threatening to cut off their support.
Wow.
Both military and financial.
That would put them in a tough spot.
No doubt about it.
And what about Europe?
What about them?
If the U.S. backs off,
yeah,
do they step up and support Ukraine on their own?
It's a tough choice.
Because that could mean more conflict.
It could even lead to a wider war.
But if they don't support Ukraine...
Then what?
Then it looks like they're letting the U.S. call all the shots.
Right, and that could damage their relationship with Ukraine.
Not to mention embolden Russia.
Exactly. They're in a real bind.
It's a classic dilemma.
With no easy answers.
So all these other countries are involved, like China and Turkey.
Right.
Do they have a say in all this?
They could potentially...
Should they be involved in the peace talks?
That's tricky. The expert talks about how hard it is to choose mediators.
Yeah.
Like, who do you trust, to be fair?
Because some countries have their own agendas.
Exactly. And the expert brings up Turkey specifically.
Okay.
Because they're in NATO, but they're also close with Russia.
So it's hard to know where their loyalties lie.
It raises questions about their neutrality.
For sure. And the choice of mediator itself can be a power move.
Absolutely.
The expert even mentions the possibility of the U.S. trying to be a mediator.
Interesting.
Which again makes you wonder about their true motivations.
It's a delicate dance.
It's like they want to be the referee and the player at the same time.
It's not uncommon in international relations.
Okay, so we've talked about what victory might look like, the chances of a ceasefire versus a full peace agreement, and what all these different players want.
We've barely scratched the surface.
But what about the human cost of all this?
Oh, absolutely. We can't forget about the people who are caught in the middle of all of this.
Like the Ukrainian children?
Yes, you specifically mentioned that in your request.
The ones who are taken from the occupied territories.
It's a heartbreaking situation.
What's going to happen to them?
It's a major concern, and the expert emphasizes that this issue needs to be addressed in any peace deal.
Because right now, they're basically bargaining chips.
It's a really tough situation, and it raises questions about how we achieve justice in these kinds of conflicts.
Yeah, how do you balance accountability with the desire for peace?
It's a dilemma, and it highlights the fact that there are no easy answers in this whole mess.
So is this appeasement, then?
The big question.
Are we just giving Putin what he wants to avoid a bigger fight?
Well, the expert makes some comparisons to the appeasement of Hitler in the 30s.
Uh-oh.
But they argue that while there might be some similarities on the surface, the motivations are actually different.
Okay, so it's not a simple case of history repeating itself.
It's more nuanced than that.
So what's driving the U.S. then?
It's probably a mix of things: Trump wanting a diplomatic win, maybe some business interests, and a strategic goal of weakening the relationship between Russia and China.
So basically the U.S. is looking out for number one.
It seems that way.
But is that the right approach in the long run?
That's for you to decide.
Wow, that's a lot to think about.
It certainly is, and we've only just begun to unpack all of this.
So much more to discuss.
We've got a lot more ground to cover.
All right, well, let's take a quick break and then we'll dive back in.
Sounds good.
All right, so we've talked about how complex this whole situation is and just how much is at stake.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It really feels like the world is holding its breath.
Waiting to see what happens next.
But even if a peace agreement is reached...
Right, even if they sign a piece of paper...
the impact of this conflict will be felt for years.
Absolutely. This war has already changed things in huge ways.
So even if the fighting stops, the impact will continue.
The ripple effects will be felt for a long time.
In what way?
Well, for one, it's exposed some real vulnerabilities in the international system. Like, how do we prevent this from happening again?
Right, because this whole thing has really raised questions.
About the effectiveness of institutions.
Like the UN.
The UN, exactly. Like, are they really able to prevent aggression?
Can they ensure global security?
That's the question. And right now, it seems like everything's up in the air.
Yeah, alliances, partnerships, even just basic norms of behavior between countries.
Like someone hit the reset button on the whole world order.
And speaking of that reset button, one of the big issues has been about NATO membership for Ukraine.
Right. It's a major point of contention.
Russia's totally against it.
Adamantly opposed.
So do you think it's still a possibility?
I mean, could Ukraine still join NATO?
Yeah.
It seems unlikely, especially with the current political climate in the U.S.
But wouldn't that be a huge victory for Russia?
It would definitely be a win for them.
I mean, isn't that their whole goal?
To keep Ukraine out of NATO.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's one of their primary objectives.
So if Ukraine doesn't join NATO...
it kind of looks like we're rewarding Russia for their aggression.
And what kind of message does that send to other countries?
Exactly. It sets a dangerous precedent.
Like suddenly it's okay to just invade your neighbors.
And get away with it.
And nobody's going to do anything about it.
It undermines the whole idea of international law.
So it's about more than just Ukraine's security.
It's about global security. It's about setting a standard.
Right. Like if we let this slide...
then what's to stop other countries from doing the same thing?
Okay, so let's say for a minute...
hypothetical situation here.
that some kind of peace agreement is reached. One that involves a ceasefire.
Right.
And some kind of peacekeeping force to keep things stable.
To maintain the peace.
What would that even look like?
That's a great question, and the expert spends some time on this.
Because who would be involved?
Yeah, and could they actually keep the peace?
Would it be like a UN peacekeeping mission?
Possibly, but the expert expresses some doubts.
About
whether a traditional UN mission would work in this case.
Because...
But Russia hasn't exactly been known for following UN resolutions in the past.
So it sounds like you'd need a stronger force.
Something with a bit more bite.
Something that would make Russia think twice about messing around.
Exactly. You need a credible deterrent.
So what are the options?
Well, the expert suggests a multinational force.
Okay.
One that includes some serious military powers.
Like who?
Maybe even the U.S.
Wait, the U.S. would send troops?
It's a possibility.
But wouldn't that just escalate things?
It's a risk.
It's like you're poking the bear.
It can be seen as provocative.
So finding the right balance is key.
You need a force that's strong enough to be effective.
But not so strong that it triggers another war.
It's a delicate balance.
And there are other complications, too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like who's in charge?
Right, who's the boss?
What are their goals?
What's their mandate?
How are they going to pay for all this?
The logistics are mind-boggling.
And how long are they going to stay there?
It's a long list of questions.
With no easy answers.
It's a real puzzle.
And speaking of puzzles...
What about them?
We talked earlier about these other countries.
Like China and Turkey.
Yeah.
What's their role?
Should they be involved in the peace talks?
Well, the expert has some concerns about involving certain countries.
Wow.
They specifically mentioned Turkey.
Okay.
Because they're in NATO.
Right.
But they're also close with Russia.
So it's hard to know where they stand?
Exactly. Are they neutral?
Can they be trusted to be fair?
Those are important questions.
It's a tough position to be in.
You're trying to be a friend to everyone.
But you can't please everyone all the time.
And sometimes you end up pleasing no one.
And then the expert brings up this other possibility.
What's that?
The U.S. acting as a mediator.
The U.S. Really?
Yeah. What do you think about that?
It seems like a conflict of interest.
Because they've been supporting Ukraine.
Exactly.
So can they really be impartial?
That's the question.
It's like trying to be the judge in a case.
Where you've already picked a side.
Right. And the expert suggests that this might be a way for the U.S. to push their own agenda.
What do you mean?
Like maybe they're hoping to get back in good with Russia?
Economically.
Yeah. Maybe they see a chance to make some deals.
It's possible.
But is that ethical?
Is it right to prioritize your own interests?
Especially when so much is at stake.
That's a question for the philosophers.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential for a peace agreement,
Mm-hmm.
the role of these different players, and the whole question of appeasement.
It's a lot to unpack.
But even if a peace treaty is signed and the fighting stops, is there any guarantee that it's going to last?
That's the million-dollar question.
Can we really trust Putin to keep his word?
I mean, he hasn't exactly been a beacon of trustworthiness in the past.
So even if they shake hands and sign a piece of paper,
right,
the threat of war would still be there.
It's a real possibility.
Like a shadow hanging over everything.
Exactly. You're living with this constant uncertainty.
And the expert points out that even small incidents...
Like a minor border skirmish?
Could escalate into something much bigger.
Absolutely. It's a very volatile situation.
So it's like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand.
It might look stable for a while.
But it could all come crashing down at any moment.
That's a good analogy.
So what do we do?
I wish I had the answer to that.
How do we prevent this from happening again?
It's a question that keeps me up at night.
All right, well, let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
Let's talk about the long game.
Meaning?
Assuming some kind of peace agreement is reached.
All right.
How do you see this conflict shaping the future?
Wow, that's a big question.
I mean, how will this change the balance of power in the world?
It's already changed things in profound ways.
Like how?
Countries are reevaluating their alliances.
Okay.
They're rethinking their priorities.
Makes sense.
They're questioning everything they thought they knew about the world.
So are we talking about a new world order?
Possibly.
Like a complete realignment of countries and alliances?
It could be a fundamental shift in how countries interact with each other.
So this is bigger than just Russia and Ukraine?
Much bigger. This is a global event.
It's like we're watching a slow-motion earthquake.
And we don't even know the full extent of the damage yet.
Wow.
It's going to take time for the dust to settle.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
A lot of ground.
We've talked about the possibility of peace.
Uh-huh.
The role of all these different players.
Right.
The question of appeasement.
And the long-term consequences.
It's been a lot to take in.
It's a lot to process.
And it's left me feeling kind of overwhelmed, to be honest.
I understand.
But also hopeful.
Hopeful?
Yeah, hopeful that we can learn from this.
I like that.
That we can use this experience to build a better future.
It's a good thought to hold on to.
All right, so in the final part of our deep dive, I want to explore what we can do moving forward.
Meaning?
How can we as individuals contribute to a more peaceful world?
I like where you're going with this.
So we've talked about the potential for peace, the role of the various players' appeasement, and the long-term implications for global power dynamics.
We've covered a lot of ground.
It's been a lot to process.
It really has.
But it feels like the big question now is...
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
How do we move forward?
What can we learn from all of this?
That's the key, isn't it?
And how can we as individuals contribute to a more peaceful world?
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
This conflict is a wake-up call.
It really is.
It shows us that peace is fragile.
And we can't take it for granted.
We have to actively work towards it.
Absolutely. We can't just assume it'll happen on its own.
You mentioned earlier that there are some valuable lessons we can learn from this experience.
They did.
What are some of those lessons?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways for me is the importance of diplomacy and dialogue.
Makes sense.
This conflict really highlights the consequences of communication breakdowns.
And the failure to address grievances peacefully.
Exactly. Talking is always better than fighting.
So proactive communication is essential for preventing conflict.
I would say so, yes, communication is key.
It's almost like preventative health care for international relations.
That's a great analogy.
You catch the problems early.
Right.
And you can hopefully avoid the worst-case scenario.
It's about building trust and understanding.
And keeping those lines of communication open.
Even when it's difficult.
Another important lesson
is
the need to strengthen international institutions and norms.
Couldn't agree more.
because this conflict has exposed some weaknesses.
It certainly has.
In the current systems.
Like the UN, for example.
Right. Are they really effective at preventing aggression?
Are they able to hold countries accountable?
So we need to reinforce the rules of the game.
To make it clear that this kind of behavior is unacceptable.
And to deter countries from acting with impunity.
Absolutely.
But that requires global cooperation.
It does.
A commitment to multilateralism.
Yeah.
And a willingness to hold those who break the rules accountable.
It's not easy, but it's necessary.
This whole conflict is challenging us.
In a lot of ways.
To rethink how we approach international relations.
It's a wake-up call.
Okay, so we need stronger diplomacy.
Right.
Reinforced international institutions.
Yes.
And a renewed commitment to global cooperation.
Those are the big takeaways.
But what about the role of individuals?
What about us?
What can we do to make a difference?
Well, for one, we can't just sit back and watch.
We can't be passive observers.
Exactly. We need to stay informed.
We need to engage in thoughtful discussions.
And we need to hold our leaders accountable.
Don't just accept the headlines at face value.
Do your own research. Question the narratives.
Be critical consumers of information.
And don't underestimate the power of your voice.
Yeah, speak up, advocate for peace.
Support organizations that are working to promote dialogue and understanding.
And let your elected representatives know how you feel.
It's about being an active citizen.
Not just in your own country.
But in the global community.
And remember, even small actions can make a difference.
They really can.
Like having constructive conversations with friends and family.
Sharing accurate information.
Promoting empathy and understanding.
All of these things can contribute to a more peaceful world.
It's not about grand gestures.
It's not about political pronouncements.
It's about each of us doing what we can in our own way.
To make the world a better place.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey.
It has been quite a journey.
We've explored the complexities of this conflict.
From all angles.
The motivations of the key players.
The potential outcomes.
The lessons we can learn.
And how we can all contribute to a more peaceful world.
It's been a lot to take in.
A lot to process.
But it's been incredibly insightful.
I agree.
And it's left me feeling both challenged and hopeful.
I feel that way too.
Challenged by the complexity of the situation.
Yeah.
But hopeful that we can learn from this experience.
Absolutely.
And work together to create a better future.
I think that's a great note to end on.
The future is not predetermined.
It's shaped by the choices we make.
And by choosing to engage.
To understand.
And to act.
We can contribute to a more peaceful and just world for everyone.
So to our listener, we leave you with this final thought.
The future is in our hands.
Let's choose peace.